Welcome, everyone, and thanks very much for giving up your time this evening if you're here in the Southern Hemisphere, and good morning if you're there in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a webinar, I should say, offered by the Ross Parsons Centre for Commercial, Corporate and Taxation Law here at Sydney Law School. My name is Jason Harris. I'm a Professor of Corporate Law here at Sydney Law School, and I'm also the Director of the Ross Parsons Centre. Many of you online will have attended some of our other webinars throughout the year, and the goal of this webinar series is to really provide a bridge between some of the excellent research that our university researchers are doing, not only here in the law school, but also throughout Australia and internationally, and to provide a bridge for that academic research to the profession. The topic tonight certainly is a good example of that. So tonight we'll be discussing navigating the consumer data right, a business perspective. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Natalia Jevglevskaya, who's a research fellow at UNSW, and you can find her full bio on the events page at Sydney Law School. And our commentator this evening is Alicia Abaratney, who's a Senior Manager in Digital Policy and DD&A at the National Australia Bank. Now, this session, like all of our webinars, is being recorded, and we will be posting a copy of that recording onto our YouTube page and our podcast page. So all registered attendees will get a copy of the recording sometime in the next few days. There will also be some time for questions at the end. So during our presentations and discussions, if anyone who's an attendee has any questions for our presenters tonight, if you can just post them in the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar there, and I'll be monitoring the questions as we go. And so there will be some time for questions, general questions at the end of the session. Well, without further ado, I'll hand over to Natalia.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you very much, Alicia, for finding time to join me. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the land of Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, or the traditional custodians of the land on which I speak to you today. And I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be joining us. So I, and also Alicia joining, will be talking to you today about businesses under the CDR. The topic is important as businesses of all sizes, small, medium, large, contribute to the operation and developments of the CDR regime, which, with the legislative framework introduced in 2019 and then actual launch happening since July 2020, has already undergone multiple iterations and keeps evolving, one could say, day by day. So if we want the CDR to achieve its objectives, understanding the needs and capacities of businesses is important. A better understanding of the effects the CDR framework has had on businesses or service providers can help identify its deficiencies and inform the direction for future reforms. Since we have a lot of slides to cover this evening, I suggest we proceed straight to the point. One last caveat, though, to ensure that all our listeners are on the same page, I will need to cover some information that may be rather basic. So I'm asking those listeners who may be reasonably familiar with the CDR to stay patient, because details will come too. So with that, we'll proceed to the first slide. CDR has been established to empower consumers to instruct service providers or data holders to share their consumer data with chosen businesses, so these businesses could offer consumers a better value for money service. CDR thus gives consumers the ability to exercise greater control of data once used by service providers for their own ends, and requires the latter to unlock the silos of consumer data. Businesses under the CDR can assume a variety of roles. They can be data holders. They can also be data recipients, accredited or not. They can also be consumers. The regime equally treats individuals and legal entities as consumers. Notably, it has no financial or other threshold for non-individuals to be CDR consumers, meaning that businesses of all sizes can benefit from the CDR. Most recent amendments to the framework created the notion of CDR business consumer. As we will discuss in more detail later, business consumers have a special status now under CDR. They enjoy broader powers when it comes to sharing of their CDR data. Businesses can also assume a combination of roles. They can be data holders and accredited data recipients. Either way, depending on which hat one puts on to access the regime, the rights and obligations and thus the challenges businesses may be facing will differ. And therefore, for the purposes of this webinar, we'll discuss each category of business participants separately. And just as a side note, CDR language deliberately uses businesses and not corporations to emphasize that it is open to a broader category of entities than those regulated under the Corporations Act. And the explanatory memorandum to the regime explicitly states that even if the person seeking accreditation is not registered as a corporation under the Corporation Act, they may apply for accreditation. So with that in mind, in what follows, I will start with a brief overview of the CDR to take stock of where we started and where we are now. We will then look at the role of businesses as data holders under the regime. We proceed to data recipients. We then touch upon the functionality of action initiation as something that immediately concerns both data holders and data recipients, and conclude with considering businesses in their roles as consumers and CDR business consumers. Going to the legal basis. The legal basis for the CDR consists of several instruments. Namely, we have the CDR Act, which incorporates Part 4D into the Competition and Consumer Act and serves as a framework legislation. Above all, it outlines the overarching objectives of the regime, sets out role and functions of regulatory bodies, and enshrines stringent privacy protections through its privacy safeguards. But then we have designation instruments, which designate sectors of the economy to which the CDR data applies and specifies the types of data covered. In the banking sector, CDR data includes various types of customer data, account and transaction data relating to 29 different products, from savings account to credit card accounts to mortgage and personal loan accounts. Sectoral designations also identify the data holders, which include authorized deposit-taking institutions in the banking sector, energy retailers and other prescribed entities in energy, and carriers and carriage service providers in the telecommunications sector. Third, we have CDR rules, which flesh out the primary legislation. For example, they set out the circumstances in which data holders are required to disclose data in response to a valid consumer request and to whom they have to disclose that data. They also set out consent requirements, how data may be used, detail out privacy safeguards, and so on. The rules that apply generally across all sectors are set out in parts 1 to 9 and schedules 1 and 2 of the CDR rules. Sector-specific rules are set out in further schedules, being progressively added to the CDR. Finally, we have consumer data standards, which set out technical requirements for how data is shared under the CDR. Non-compliance with standards may constitute a breach of the rules, where the rules require compliance with the standards. Let's proceed to the oversight of the CDR. The Treasury leads CDR policy and is responsible for the development of CDR rules, and is also responsible for advice to government on which sectors the CDR should apply to in the future. The CDR follows a dual regulator model. Enforcement of the CDR rules and data standards is with the ACCC. The Commission also accredits data recipients, manages suspensions and revocations of accreditation, and maintains a register of accredited persons. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner enforces privacy safeguards and privacy-related CDR rules, and advises the Minister on the privacy implications of the CDR rules and data standards. The Data Standards Chair, assisted by the Data Standards Body, domiciled within Treasury, develops the technical and consumer experience standards. Since its inception, the CDR remains a work in progress and has been continuously informed by stakeholder consultations. The framework has been revised several times, and we have seen many new versions of the CDR rules, replacing rules no longer considered fit for purpose. Among the most noteworthy publicly conducted consultations are the 2020 inquiry into the future directions of the consumer data right, the 2019-21 inquiry of the Select Committee on Financial Technology and Regulatory Technology. I apologize. The committee was later renamed to Select Committee on Australia's Technology and Financial Centre, and to statutory review of the consumer data right, so which happened just last year. Each of these processes was followed by the government's response, outlining the upcoming legal reforms directly or indirectly impacting the CDR framework. Most recent consultations on CDR include those relating to action initiation, consent review, non-bank lending, and immediately relevant to the operation of CDR is also the consultation on screen scraping. Over the years, the framework, by design, has been expanded to multiple economy sectors. So far, designated have been banking, energy, telecommunications, and non-bank lending, referred to as open finance on this diagram. I note that the CDR's expansion to telecommunications sector has been put on hold mid this year to allow the regime mature in finance and energy first. So it is hoped that once CDR has proven to operate smoothly in these sectors, future economy sectors or subsectors such as superannuation and insurance will follow. What we need to be aware of, and as Australians also duly proud of, is the scope and achievements of our data sharing regime. As you can see on the slide, while systems for data sharing in banking and finance are developing across the globe, Australia remains the only jurisdiction whose data sharing framework from inception was designed to apply across sectors and ultimately economy-wide. The only other state that may be following in Australia's footsteps is New Zealand, although the relevant legislation on New Zealand's consumer data right hasn't been passed yet. Europe and the United Kingdom, and despite the UK's Smart Data Initiative, are still focusing mostly on banking. And once they and other jurisdictions start looking into expanding to other sectors, it will probably be a different journey unless they choose to adopt the same approach as Australia has, namely an umbrella framework with sectoral designation instruments, which makes expansion to other sectors of the economy and also due attention to sector-specific needs in Australia possible. And also note here that this map is just one view of where other jurisdictions find themselves on their journey to open banking and finance, and you will find plenty of other views and representations online, including, for example, this one. So, excuse me, what data does the regime regulate? As stipulated in section 56 CA paragraph 1, it is CDR data. CDR data covers information specified in a relevant designation instrument and information subsequently wholly or partly derived from the data. Designed to apply to key data sets, the regime has a strong focus on data sets that deliver tangible benefits for consumers, either as a single data set or in combination with others. There are generally two types of CDR data: data which identifies or makes a CDR consumer reasonably identifiable, and data about a good or service or product data. For example, in banking, data that identifies or describes a certain product includes the type of product, its name, pricing, features. Data relating to a consumer includes information that identifies a consumer, name, address, date of birth, account data, such as account number, balance, relevant authorizations, and so on. I believe Alicia may be jumping in to provide some comments on the derived data at this stage, so I'll hand over to Alicia.
Thanks, Natalia, and thanks so much for, firstly, the invitation to come and speak today to yourself and Dr. Harris and the Sydney Law School for spotlighting the CDR, which in my view is such an important regulation. And as someone who's practiced in both privacy and competition law, really brings these two different areas of practice together. I should say that, this is something that I've worked in at the bank at NAB, but I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. But I think this concept of derived data, or wholly or partly derived data, is a really interesting facet of the CDR regime. And Natalia, you've alluded to the statutory review, which was conducted by Elizabeth Kelly late last year. And I think this definition of CDR derived data, it started that's been wholly or partly derived from CDR data and so forth, recursively, and so it goes on. And I think the breadth of that definition does pose challenges to those participants in the ecosystem as to where does that stop? When does data cease being CDR data? And I think this was something that was really called out by both participants in the ecosystem and also the statutory review, where it was suggested perhaps we need to look at this setting and see whether it is in fact fit for purpose. Often we talk about this poison pill analogy of CDR data, where there may be one piece of CDR data that's commingled with other personal information or other data sets, and then that means that the whole set of data then needs to be treated as CDR data. And as we'll come to later, that comes with InfoSec requirements, that comes with permitted uses, and so there's a need to sort of quarantine that. So I think that is something where certainly participants would like to see reform to ensure that as we move forward, there are more sort of participants and there is more adoption around the regime.
Right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Alicia, for this very important point. So then we'll leave now the derived data aside and proceed to the data holders. In a nutshell, data holders have the following key roles under the CDR. They have to provide the necessary infrastructure to enable requests to be made for product and consumer data. They have to disclose general product data about products they offer, such as interest rates in banking, fees and charges, discounts, and other features. They have to securely transfer, with a consumer's authorization, of course, a consumer's data in a machine-readable format when they receive a valid request. And lastly, they have to manage a consumer's authorization to disclose CDR data and any amendment or withdrawal of that authorization. When it comes to the performance by data holders so far, the good news is that about 99.74% of household deposits are currently covered by CDR data sharing, near total coverage. Further, data holders are required to have their systems available and able to service consumer data requests 99.5% of the time, measured monthly. And currently they do so 99.41% of the time. So a reasonably close hit. Having said this, the majority of data holders, specifically 72%, didn't meet the compliance targets set in the phase timetable on time. 92% of data holders that revealed implementation gaps in December last year have reported to the ACCC that most of these will be resolved by the end of 2023, this year. However, there are still a large number of gaps that have no specified time frame for resolution. Some would say that despite some good stats, the initial resistance shown by data holders towards the regime, meaning their data being taken away from them, so this initial resistance hasn't yet been overcome. Some would also argue that this resistance is reflected in at least two major issues, which have been repeatedly flagged as an impediment to successful CDR rollout, namely data quality and consent flow. And I will address each of them now in turn. Let's go to data quality. It goes without saying that for an efficient consumer data sharing framework, it is critical that shared data is reliable and usable. Data quality is a concept that covers a range of CDR data holder obligations and is relevant to both consumer data and product data. As per Privacy Safeguard 11, data holders must ensure that the data they disclose is accurate, up-to-date, and complete. Now, during Elizabeth Kelly's review, statutory review of the CDR last year, quite a number of participants spoke about issues of inconsistent data quality, with a number of data recipients suggesting that product development has been held back by data range and quality issues. FData, for example, which is the Financial Data and Technology Association, and non-for-profit, representing fintechs operating in open banking and open finance. So FData noted that many of its members regularly share concerns around poor quality data, delays in data being received, in some cases up to 24 hours by major banks, missing fields, erroneous data fields, garbled and inconsistent data. Many complained that the information that could make open banking genuinely disruptive was simply missing. And so the statutory review has found that data quality has limited the wide adoption of the CDR framework, and that data quality must improve for the CDR to realize its potential. It acknowledged that the current fast pace of CDR rollout into new sectors has not allowed enough time for the system to mature and capitalize on the lessons learned. However, it urged to focus efforts on improving CDR data quality in already designated sectors and balance them with the overall forward momentum into new sectors over time. Following the release of the statutory review, the ACCC ran a public consultation on improving data quality in the CDR to gather further views on the prevalence of data quality issues, harm resulting from these issues, and approaches to these issues from a compliance and enforcement perspective. And in April this year, the ACCC published findings from the stakeholder consultation and actions it intended to take. ACCC's key findings, as you can see on the slide, were that the quality of consumer data is generally sufficient to support the delivery of CDR products and services, although improvements are required. The Commissioner also noted significant shortcomings in the quality of product reference data. Now, recent industry reports confirm ACCC's findings. The quality of the product reference data indeed remains an issue, with shortcomings in this data hindering the effective use of comparison services. Some industry participants observe that the irony here is that product reference data is available via publicly accessible APIs with no consumer consent required. So it's the low risk, publicly available data that's falling short of regulatory requirements. So this is not to say, as we mentioned, that consumer data is not without issues, and resolving these issues is not an overnight fix, given the complexity in data holder systems. But also the sentiments among data recipients appear to be that data quality is not always a priority for some data holders, that still deal with the challenges of implementing these CDR obligations. Some also feel that the onus is on them to resolve issues related to the quality of data that they've had received from data holders. Now, the government has committed funding through its 23-24 budget for CDR agencies to continue supporting CDR operations and working closely with data holders to improve data quality so that CDR data is accurate and reliable. So we shall stay tuned and see whether next year, for example, we have better stats on data quality coming out. Moving on to consent issues. Consent is at the heart of the CDR regime. Ensuring that consent is genuinely informed and given freely is becoming increasingly difficult in our data-driven digital age. As you know, it's commonplace for consumers, including us, overwhelmed by the detail and extent of the terms and conditions of service, to choose "I agree" and tick the box without any real understanding of what we're agreeing to, and with no real choice but to agree if we are to receive the desired product or service. So this is a problem that the CDR intends to avoid. Now, to ensure that consumers are indeed in control of their data, the current version of the CDR rules mandates that consumers must not be forced to share their data, cannot be deemed to have provided an implied or open-ended consent, must understand what they're consenting to, and must be able to revoke their consent to data sharing. From the business perspective, consent is the ticket that opens the door to data sharing and influences its speed and reliability of the data sharing processes. So now the consent architecture under the CDR, as you can see, is still quite complex. We have different types of consents, starting from collection consents and going to use consent, direct marketing consent, and so on and so forth. Unsurprisingly, the statutory review of the CDR found that the CDR is not yet optimized to meet consumers' needs and experience of a clear and efficient consent. In its submission, BASIC, for example, noted that up to 11 screens, and some suggest it could be 30, so up to 11 or 30 screens could be presented to a consumer in the steps to link a bank account to a data recipient's service, including pre-consent, consent, authentication, and authorization. And BASIC also flagged that this doesn't include additional screens that may be required for the bank login process, including user registration, email verification, KYC, and so on and so forth. So instead of a consent to work, we often end up with friction, high cognitive load for consumers, and their ultimate disengagement from the service. So this had led the Treasury to open public consultations conducted from August until October this year on how the consent flow could be enhanced without undermining protections that the consent provisions guarantee under the CDR framework. I believe the aim is to boil down the consent flow to as few as possible screens, possibly even one, but please don't quote me on this just yet. In the meantime, an analysis of consent conversion collected by Froller between January and August this year found that 27% of consent attempts fail on the data holder side after the consent has been collected by the data recipient. This is the industry average, with some banks showing a failure rate of 33 or 32%. Out of the big four banks, only one performed significantly better with a failure rate of only 18%. To understand why so many attempts fail, Froller conducted a survey on 747 customers. What came out was that the customers couldn't log into their bank. The majority of the users had issues with their one-time password. That was the case in 48% of the cases. Just over a third had issues after logging into their bank, including error messages and not being sent back to the ADR app to complete the account linking. 12% were not able to select the account to which they wanted to link, and some other issues were identified too. So what we can conclude at this stage is that data holders are still facing quite a number of issues that must be resolved for CDR, including open banking, to work, and that the government and regulators are currently working on optimizing the consent architecture and flow under the CDR. Now, also given the pending rollout of action initiation, on which more will follow a bit later, ensuring informed but also consumer-friendly consumer consent for action initiation will be critical. And so it's particularly important to get consent flow for data sharing only right now in the first place, before we move on to action initiation. Now, moving on to data recipients. The foremost concern for data recipients will be to gain access to the CDR regime. Under the inaugural version of the CDR, only accredited data recipients included in the electronic register for accredited persons were allowed access to data. Such a conservative design was deliberate. It aimed at securing optimum levels of data safety for consumers. And so inaugural version of the CDR rules set one general level of accreditation, the unrestricted level, which provided access to all CDR data at the time in banking. Applicants with an unrestricted AID license could benefit from a streamlined accreditation process, meaning they would automatically be able to access accreditation of this at this unrestricted level. Non-ADIs, including the vast majority of fintechs, could join the CDR participant group provided they met stringent accreditation requirements set out in the CDR rules. So this accreditation model has been heavily criticized for unfairly benefiting large incumbent financial institutions. It has been argued that the cost of accreditation was prohibitively high for smaller players in the market, such as non-ADIs. Many complained that the accreditation process was too stringent and too lengthy, involving review after review, with some warning that interested parties may have to be ready to spend, or may have to be ready to spend an average of 250,000 Australian dollars to secure their ADR status. Excuse me. These concerns probably were also reflected in the low number of entities entering the register. In the first 6 months after the rollout of the CDR in banking, we only had 9 data holders registered and 6 data recipients. And so in response to this problem, we had amendments coming out in September 2021. These amendments introduced the sponsored level of accreditation, which permits an unrestricted accredited data recipient to sponsor other parties to participate in the CDR regime. This accreditation model is still current, although further nuances to the scheme were introduced later, which we will discuss in a minute. So in other words, 2 major models of accreditation are available to CDR participants. There is an unrestricted level of participants who can collect CDR data directly from data holders. And for a minute, I'll just jump to the next slide. So unrestricted level participants, green ADRs, can collect CDR data directly from data holders with the consumer's consent, of course. Unrestricted ADRs must provide an independent third-party assurance report confirming that their systems and processes meet the requisite CDR information security requirements. In contrast, for sponsored participants, also known as affiliates, and who are subject to the same accreditation criteria as accredited data recipients, it is enough to self-attest to their ability to meet the requisite information security requirements. Affiliates cannot collect CDR data from a data holder, but primarily through their sponsors who collect CDR data on the affiliate's behalf. An affiliate must also have a sponsorship arrangement with the sponsor, whereby the sponsor agrees to disclose to the affiliate CDR data it holds as an ADR, and the affiliate undertakes to provide the sponsor with such information and access to its operation as needed for the sponsor to comply with its sponsorship obligations. Like all ADRs, affiliates are generally liable for their use and disclosure of CDR data they receive. Now, for a second I'll jump back to my previous slide. So amendments to the inaugural model stop here. They also introduced the possibility to participate in the CDR without accreditation. Specifically, access to CDR was allowed to outsource service providers, representatives, trusted advisors, and in case of asking for some low-risk information, also for CDR insights. So you can see that these entities marked red on this slide. We start first with the outsourced service providers. These are entities, usually technology companies, that collect CDR data from data holders on behalf of the accredited data recipients to provide accredited data recipients with services such as data processing, storage, data analytics, and other technical or operational services that support the CDR ecosystem. there will be an arrangement between an ADR and an OSP, subject to which the OSP must protect the service data as if it were an ADR. Importantly, ADRs are in this case liable under the CDR framework for any collection, use, or disclosure of service data by their OSP and their OSP's subcontractors. Second come representatives. A CDR representative has an arrangement with an accredited data recipient principal, which allows the representative to receive CDR data from the CDR principal to provide goods or services directly to the consumer, and hence you see that blue line going all the way to consumer. What is important to note is that the CDR representative arrangement must reflect CDR rules applicable to the CDR representative, in particular to protect the data as if it were the principal, and not to use or disclose that data other than in accordance with the contract with the principal. Representatives may collect CDR data only from their principals and not from other ADRs or data holders, and the liability for the actions of the CDR representative rests with the CDR principal. Now, third and most controversial group is trusted advisors. Under the trusted advisor model, a consumer can nominate persons outside the CDR scheme as trusted advisors, and accredited persons may disclose the consumer data to such trusted advisors. The classes of trusted advisors are listed in the CDR rules and include professions that are considered to be appropriately regulated to ensure a strong level of consumer protection. And they include qualified accountants, persons admitted to the legal profession, registered tax agent, and, for example, mortgage brokers. To note here is that in contrast to representatives and OSPs who remain bound by the CDR rules through the representative and OSP's arrangements, trusted advisors are not bound by the CDR rules. Notably, the standards developed by the Data Standards Body state that data disclosed to trusted advisors will not be regulated as part of the Consumer Data Act, and the data recipients must advise the consumer to review how the non-accredited person will handle their data. So what this means in a nutshell is that although trusted advisors are allowed access to CDR data, this access is not accompanied by any duties under the CDR framework or reflective of the CDR rules. Instead, the rules rely on the presumed effectiveness of information security obligations that trusted advisors may be subject to due to their professional standing. These information security obligations tend to be flexible, non-specific, and their effective implementation is often a real challenge, and they can also vary substantially among trusted advisors depending on their size and available resources and expertise. And so, as argued, for example, by the Australian Banking Association, we're faced with a situation where within seconds, the customer's data will travel from the most secure setting at the bank to no or uncertain security with trusted advisors.
I might just jump in there, Natalia. I guess going back to your previous slide as well, and I think that was titled the simplified version, it does speak to the growing trend of regulatory complexity that we're seeing here in the privacy space, for sure, I think. And one call out, I guess, or one lens on this, I think you're right when you say a lot of these different pathways in the CDR were concessions to pragmatism, right, to encourage adoption within the system. And the trusted advisor model was predicated on the fact that these different advisors were subject to these rules, you know, lawyers, fiduciary duties, or mortgage brokers or others. But I guess one other lens you could put on that is also, what does it say about sort of the existing state of privacy laws? If it is the case that this the fact that data outside of the CDR is not held in a way that is believed to be sort of fit for purpose or adequately protective, and we can look at issues such as, you know, the carve out for small businesses, which are not subject to the Privacy Act, and that is sort of represents a large proportion of our economy. And I think it also perhaps shows the comparative protectiveness of the CDR regime, which I often say is a gold standard in terms of privacy protection when you look at those consent frameworks that you've alluded to previously. And then also, I think things like the data minimization, which is embedded in the CDR. So I guess that's another lens to put on this, is the fact that it is such a high standard, and comparatively, and I think that's something perhaps people don't realize, comparatively, the CDR is a really strong and protective regime as compared to perhaps others, including the Federal Privacy Act.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Alicia. It is a very important point, and I wonder at some points I was wondering whether that allows us this loosening of the very strict information security controls that CDR otherwise puts in place, whether that brings us down from Golden Star to the Silver Star. But I guess probably for now we are aware of possible concerns that this loosening creates, and we shall wait and see how this now will unravel in practice. If you want to, our listeners want to get more understanding or a better idea of an argument in favor of the consumers, so the concerns that are raised by the consumer representative groups, then I strongly recommend you engage with the article by my colleague Anton Didenko, which is freely available on SSRN. But clearly from the business perspective, what we can note here is that the intention was to enable more businesses to take part at the regime, and this is clearly now happening with these alternative data access schemes. So,
Sorry, Charlie, just to jump in again, I think probably to touch on, as we go to action initiation, this model does need to be looked at again, I think, and considered from that lens to see whether it is indeed sort of fit for purpose as we move from read access to write access.
Exactly. Well, thank you. And however, before we move to action initiation, just a quick jump on the following slide to see what are the numbers that we're actually having at the moment when talking about businesses. So as you can see on the diagram, the number of businesses offering CDR-powered use cases is steadily growing. There are currently 40 or probably 41 unrestricted ADRs, of which 31 are active, and this is the double of what we had 2 years ago. There is one sponsored participant affiliate. Now for CDR representatives, the numbers are considerably higher, with 101 CDR representatives as of the 3rd of October this year. So the intent of the CDR representative model was to get more and smaller fintechs in the system, then that certainly seems to be succeeding. And now before we go to action initiation, another interesting point is screen scraping. And this is an issue that data recipients may need to address in navigating the CDR. Currently, some accredited data recipients still rely on screen scraping. And screen scraping, in finance at least, is practice whereby consumers give away their bank login credentials to third parties, so these parties can gain access to their data and provide products and services. Screen scraping has been valued by businesses, specifically fintechs, for many reasons. Above all, its high efficiency and relatively low cost. Given that much of the data prior to the emergence of the CDR was siloed with banks, screen scraping allowed fintechs to come to existence. Because of the data quality issues that we discussed earlier, many fintechs informed the statutory review that until these data quality issues are addressed, they will have little choice but to keep relying on screen scraping to support their use cases. There are good reasons to argue that screen scraping, since it is not specifically regulated, not yet, has potentially significantly slowed down the rollout of the CDR. Now, the government has recently conducted public consultations with the aim to gain deeper insights as to what extent screen scraping remains a viable alternative to the CDR, and we are waiting for the results of those consultations to come out soon. if the government indeed chooses to move away from screen scraping, many data recipients will surely appreciate a clear signal from the government on when and how the implementation of the ban will take effect, because understandably, they would need adequate time for their businesses to transition from screen scraping to CDR only.
I might just build on that, Natalia. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's probably, it's fair to say there's broad consensus that screen scraping is, right now a suboptimal practice, whereas it sort of was initially the way in which data capture was conducted. But I think if you look at that across the sort of fraud and scams that are on the rise and really endemic in Australia. Last year, I think the ACCC, a scam centre, said there was $3.1 billion lost. So it is a practice that I think gives mixed messages to consumers. On the one hand, we say don't share your NIN and PIN, and then on the other hand, they're encouraged to do that to enable screen scraping. I think you have written an excellent piece on screen scraping, which if listeners haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think you can find it on the SSRN platform. So definitely, I think there needs to be more understanding about what the practice is. I think even from a consumer's perspective, there is sometimes not great understanding that they're actually engaging in screen scraping. And part of that also goes back to the earlier points you touched on around the consent flow. So I think, yes, screen scraping is suboptimal, but we also need to ensure that the CDR is a compelling value proposition vis-a-vis screen scraping. And part of that will be streamlining the consent flow so that consumers will adopt it. And it is as easy to adopt as perhaps screen scraping is with a one-tick process, so that there is not sort of unnecessary friction. And as you've noted, the DSB and Treasury are looking at those consent flows where it's 30 screens. Is that too much? And we know from behavioural economics as well, you don't want to rely too heavily on consent, I think, as a means of protecting individuals. There sort of have to be other safeguards built into the system. So I think those are positive steps that we'll see, but there will obviously, there's a lot of businesses that have built up on screen scraping, so there needs to be an adequate transition away, as you've said.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Alicia. I do hope, although I wouldn't vouch for that, we need to see what will be happening to screen scraping. Indeed, from the consumer's perspective, it's an abhorrent practice and it shouldn't be happening. I don't think it should be happening in our age in 2023. But at the same time, the reality is, as you mentioned that too, a big number of businesses are still heavily relying on it. And I imagine the government will be cautious of cutting their heads off and closing so many businesses. So in any case, this is a very hot area and something to stay really tuned on.
And I guess
I hope the results will be coming out soon.
Yes, I hope so. Also, Natalia, I'm sorry, just to add on to that as well, I think your earlier point around the data sets is also important to note, because I think there are, obviously we've rolled out in banking and energy, but there are other data sets that are currently using screen scraping, whether that be superannuation or other, where there isn't the relevant coverage in CDR. So we need to have that sort of breadth of coverage in CDR as well, I think.
Yes, that's true. I would say in banking, we've just seen that on average, the data quality of consumer data is acceptable. This is the perception among most of the stakeholders. It's the product reference data which is problematic, but screen scrapers are after the consumer data more so than they're after product data. But of course, when it comes to other sectors as a superannuation, just as you mentioned, the situation is a little bit different. So it's truly, I urge the participants to follow the government's results of the consultations. There will be hopefully many submissions made publicly available so that we can gain a better and deeper understanding of how screen scraping is actually happening, how it is still helping or has already been abandoned by some of the businesses. So in the view of time, we will be moving to action initiation. So this is something that, as I alluded to before, equally concerns both data holders and data recipients. CDR, as it currently stands, enables the functionality of read access only, meaning that while consumers are able to share data with third parties, they cannot instruct them to take actions on their behalf. The new amendments, which were introduced to the Parliament in November last year, if passed, will introduce the right access functionality or action initiation functionality. These amendments would enable consumers to instruct third parties, service providers, known as accredited action initiators, to initiate actions on consumers' behalf. For example, consumers would be able to initiate payments, move funds to accounts with higher interest or lower fees, open or close accounts, switch providers, update details across multiple accounts, automate the process for undertaking loan or mortgage applications, and so on and so forth. Action initiation is made up of two parts. There is the instruction layer and the action initiation layer as proposed. The instruction layer would sit within the CDR scheme and enable a consumer to give consent for a third party, known as accredited action initiator, to send an action initiation request to an action service provider. The action service provider would then authenticate the consumer and carry out the action as they would if the request came directly from the consumer. The action service provider would carry out the action in the action layer, which is outside the scope of the CDR. So while new to Australia, some elements of action initiation have proven very successful in the European Union and the UK, which both explicitly regulate payment initiation. This proposed passage of legislation will only be the first step, though, in the process of turning action initiation on. Types of action that can be initiated using the CDR and the classes of CDR data holders that are to be action service providers will be added by ministerial declaration. Following a declaration, the minister would make rules for the action type, and rules would work alongside the data standards prepared by the Data Standards Body. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner will also prepare and publish guidelines relating to privacy safeguards. So again, this is another area relevant both for data holders and data recipients, and we shall stay tuned and see how the story unravels here. I wonder whether Alicia wants to jump in. Yes, she does.
Yeah, I will jump in again. Thanks, Natalia. I think it's probably a good point also to talk about other regulatory developments in the digital and data economy, because as you alluded to earlier, one of the sort of foundational policy papers on this is Dr. Scott Farrell's Future Directions report. And it was noted that, you know, as we move towards both broadening the regime, but also deepening the regime to allow for right access, we need to have really robust authentication and verification procedures. Right now we have OTP, which is currently being looked at by the Data Standards Board and whether that is adequate moving forward. So we also need to consider other regimes. So one notable regime being the Digital ID Bill and Framework. So for those who may be aware, that builds on the government's TDIF, or Trusted Digital Identity Framework. And that is a new piece of legislation which was recently announced in September. And for those who are familiar with the CDR, you will see many parallels in the legislative structure between digital ID, that bill, having the digital ID legislation, the digital ID rules and then accreditation, and the CDR regime. And so there are many more uses for digital ID beyond CDR, but how can the CDR be a beneficiary of digital ID? And that's something Scott Farrell called out, that, you know, digital ID will help and enable the CDR. There's a view that there could be this marketplace where there are many different digital IDs and consumers have choice with which provider they use, and there is interoperability between the CDR and the digital ID legislation and rules, so that There's ease of use and functionality, and we don't add sort of unnecessary friction. So when you're thinking about those consent screens that we talked about before, how can we build this so it is actually useful and consumer-centric, and that the two fit together? So I think that's also something in industry that we're keeping our minds to. Listeners may be aware, NABS recently supported the launch of Connect ID, which is an initiative through Australian Payments Plus, and that's a digital ID solution. There's also obviously Australia Post, MasterCard, many other providers, MyGov, that offer these services. So I think going back also to that notion of regulatory complexity, but also trying to fit all these different pieces of legislation together as we go forward. And I think there is really a sort of level of complexity there to navigate.
Thank you, Alicia, very much. There certainly is, and I just want to hope that this will be the problem for our generation only, and the next generation won't even be thinking about it because it will be running so smoothly. So in view of time, we still have a couple of minutes. I'll cover the last final slides, which are just a few. As mentioned, businesses can also act as consumers under the framework. CDR consumer is an identifiable or reasonably identifiable person, including the business enterprise, to whom the CDR data relates because of the supply of a good or service, either to a person or an associate of the person. So it must be noted here that the definition of the CDR consumer is broader than under general consumer protection legislation, including the CCA and the Australian Consumer Law. I wouldn't have any exact stats on how many businesses currently use CDR as consumers, because we generally have that problem that we don't have stats on how many consumers are actively using the regime. Hopefully it will change in the future. But as we speak, I wouldn't be able to present you any numbers. But businesses certainly do use the CDR framework, as otherwise we wouldn't have seen further amendments to the CDR, which take me to the next slide, namely CDR business consumers. So in July this year, a new notion of CDR business consumer was introduced to the framework. Now, a CDR business consumer is a CDR consumer who the accredited person has taken reasonable steps to confirm that is not an individual or has an active ABN. The amending rules were introduced because stakeholder feedback indicated that the previous CDR rules didn't cover the range of advisors or services typically used by businesses. So the amendments enable businesses to consent to accredited data recipients sharing their CDR data with specified persons who are not accredited, like bookkeepers, consultants, and software providers. And that takes me back to my very simplified and yet slightly convolutedly looking slide, where I can now see others added to the scheme. In order to disclose CDR data in accordance with this new model, an ADR must be provided. The ADR must be provided by the CDR consumer with a business consumer statement that certifies that the consent is given for the purposes of enabling the ADR to provide goods or services to the CDR business consumer in its capacity as a business and not as an individual. So to conclude on this point, unlike most individuals, CDR business consumers are allowed under the regime to choose the recipients of their data freely and regardless of accreditation. And this takes me now to concluding observations. So what we can say is that CDR has never stopped changing. Businesses of all sizes have shaped the regime and are also shaped by the regime. One of the key missing figures from the CDR is, as mentioned before, is the number of consumers that have consented to use their data through the CDR. Consumer usage is the ultimate validation of the CDR as a technology solution, though. So, but there are no publicly available figures. What we also need to see and would welcome is are more use cases that appeal to consumers. And this is why industry is arguing, well, we don't have the consumers because we're still developing and trying to make possible the use cases that would appeal to consumers. So one way or another, given the time, given the funds, given the interests invested in making the CDR work, the work should continue. And I sincerely hope it will be supported also by the future governments. I will stop here. Alicia will jump with some other comments or not. But thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions.
Yeah, that's fine. We've had one question online. If you're happy to take that just for another couple of minutes. So the question comes from my colleague here at Sydney Law School, Dr. Zofia Bednaz, and she asks, what are the success metrics that the government is relying on for the implementation of the CDR, if you know?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sophia, and I think it goes also to Natalia's earlier points around how do we measure success in the CDR. We could look to other regimes like the UK, and I think the UK has a different model, governance model. They have what's known as an open banking implementation entity, which tracks more these metrics. And I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think they were up to 5 million users, though they started a bit before us. But users really is, in my view, the metric of success. And I think part of where I see, or where I think there is reform that needs to be done, is around tweaking the statutory settings such that ADRs actually do bring more use cases to market, because the regime won't work unless businesses bring these use cases to market. That is the way in which data sharing occurs. And I think there are some aspects, and I say this every time I speak about the CDR. The CDR, in my view, is a gold standard in terms of privacy protection. But I think on the innovation side, there is room for reform. And the places where I think that reform could occur or should occur is in relation to product development and maintenance. So currently there's no ability for an accredited data recipient to seek consent for the use of identifiable data for product development and maintenance. And I think when you look at data products or products using data models, that's really important, because you think about things like model drift, and for complex data models, you need to be able to do those things. But right now there isn't that pathway. There's an ability to seek consent for de-identified data, but many in industry have considered this standard is actually not de-identification but anonymization. And I think there are issues where you take out outliers in data sets, because it actually means the data set is no longer identifiable of your underlying population. So that is also a challenge. So I think if we could look to tweak these settings, then the CDR is a really excellent regime. And similar to Natalia, I think it is something we need to build on, because I think many in industry and government have invested significantly in this regime, whether that be getting their tech stack up to date or doing all the things that they need to do to have APIs, or even the intellectual effort in understanding the regime. So I think there has been a lot of investment, and I would really like to see us build on that rather than throwing it all away and starting from scratch.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I agree with all the points that you're raising, and thank you very much, Sophia. It is a complex question. It is a very important question, though, and this is also something that the statutory review last year recommended that the stakeholders look deeper into, because many of the consumer representative groups were arguing that it's not enough for us to say we have so and these many ADRs joining the regime. We cannot celebrate this yet, because we still don't actually know how effectively the regime is being used. So having said this, the metrics are important. It's not an easy task, though, particularly given that the CDR has multiple objectives. We have the advancement of the competition, increased innovation. We also have the consumer centricity, inclusion aspect there, and the consumer protection. And these objectives must be balanced out against each other because they can be often at conflict with each other. So when we will be building those performance metrics, we probably will be coming up with a set of metrics that may occasionally or at some stages contradict each other. So to conclude at this stage, is that some of the metrics are represented at the cdr.gov.au, which I'm sure you're aware of. It will be great if more will be coming in the future. We certainly need them, but this is still hopefully work in progress.
Okay, well, I can't see any other questions. We have gone just a little bit over, but that's okay. So we might draw it to a close there. Thank you so much, Natalia and Alicia, for taking us through this. I must say, as a non-expert in this area, this does seem like a very complex regime. But as you've been explaining, the technology is still emerging, and there's lessons that we can learn from overseas as well as they can learn from our experience through these reforms. So I look forward to following your future work, Natalia, on this issue as we see the government take the next steps and businesses take the next steps in this area. And thanks so much for giving up your time, both of you, this evening to present to the Ross Parsons Centre audience. And thanks very much to the audience for giving up your time and logging in tonight. Our next Ross Parsons Centre event is actually tomorrow night at the same time. We have two Spanish professors who are visitors here this semester at the law school who will be talking about artificial intelligence and commercial contracting. So you can find details for that webinar on the Sydney Law School events page, but that will be tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. Okay, so we'll draw it to a close. Thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Alicia. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much, Jason, for having us. Thank you very much again, Alicia.
Pleasure. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.